You're about to witness your neighbor forfeit their property, not from recklessness, not from foolish decisions, but from trusting the narrative everyone's been promoting for the past 4 years. At this very moment, there's a $12 trillion explosive sitting in America's housing sector, and the wick is already lit. Here's the figure that should alarm you. 67%. That's the portion of the typical American's wealth imprisoned inside their residence. A single asset. Every egg in one container. And that container is about to tumble off a precipice. I'm going to reveal something in the next 20 minutes that won't surface on the news. Not because it's hidden, because it's too transparent. This pattern has unfolded 3 times in the past century. And right now, scene by scene, it's occurring again. The Treasury just purchased $2.3 trillion in mortgage-backed securities within 6 months. JP Morgan Chase liquidated 40% of their residential mortgage inventory in Q3 of 24. And in November, Deutsche Bank discreetly disclosed $1.2 billion in losses connected to real estate derivatives. These aren't isolated incidents, they're calculated withdrawals. The sophisticated investors have already departed, and they left you carrying the burden. By the time I'm finished, you'll understand precisely how this apparatus operates. You'll identify which phase we're experiencing, and you'll comprehend why 40 million people, potentially you, are about to learn that your greatest asset is truly your greatest weakness. Let's begin with how the mechanism functions. Every economic meltdown follows the identical framework. I call it the leverage ladder. 4 phases, identical progression every single time. Phase 1 is the base. This is when everybody feels prosperous. Asset valuations rise month after month. Credit flows like water from a ruptured pipeline. Your neighbor refinances to purchase a boat. Your cousin with a 590 credit score gets authorized for a $400,000 mortgage. Nobody challenges it because everyone's profiting. Throughout 2021 and 2022, U.S. mortgage debt surged by $2.1 trillion. That's not expansion. That's leverage. Borrowed confidence. And here's the reality about borrowed confidence. Eventually, someone demands their capital returned. Phase 2 is the snare. This is when it becomes fascinating. The masses are still rejoicing, valuations are still climbing. But if you understand where to investigate, you'll notice the insiders moving toward the doors. Examine SEC documents from the 4th quarter of 2024. CEOs from the top 12 mortgage providers liquidated $487 million worth of their own equity. Not portfolio balancing, not stepping down, liquidating. They're examining the identical information you can reach. They just comprehend what it signifies. Interest rates are elevated, but valuations haven't adjusted. That discrepancy, that's the snare. Imagine it like shears. The edges are separating and your throat is positioned right between them. Phase 3 is the catalyst. Something fractures. It's never the element everyone's monitoring. In 2008, it was subprime mortgages, loans so insignificant that Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke stated they were isolated. In 1929, it was margin debt that nobody imagined could destroy the entire economy. The catalyst is always something the specialists dismiss. Too insignificant to concern, too contained to propagate until suddenly, it's the sole thing that concerns. In phase 4, that's the avalanche. This is when time accelerates. What required 10 years to construct dissolves in 10 weeks. Compelled liquidation margin demands, liquidity just evaporates like water through a drain. Your residence isn't valued at what Zillow displays anymore. It's valued at what someone will offer when everyone's liquidating simultaneously. And what someone will offer is substantially less than you anticipate. Now, here's where it becomes extraordinary. This isn't hypothesis. This precise sequence has unfolded 3 times in contemporary history. And each instance, millions of individuals stood there declaring, "It can't affect me. Let me demonstrate." Everyone understands the stock market collapse of 1929. Black Tuesday. Financiers leaping from windows, breadlines extending for blocks. But here's what they don't instruct you in education. The collapse didn't begin on Wall Street. It began in Florida real estate 3 years prior in 1926. Visualize this. Miami in the mid-1920 seconds, land speculation has become completely insane. Individuals are purchasing marshland parcels, sight unseen. Developers are marketing prime beachfront property through newspaper advertisements to purchasers in New York and Chicago who've never even traveled to Florida. The strategy is elegant in its simplicity. You deposit 10% down on a parcel of land, transfer it to the subsequent speculator before your following payment arrives. Everyone's generating profit, Everyone's brilliant. Then in September 1926, a Category 4 hurricane strikes Miami. Abruptly, individuals actually go examine the land they purchased, and they uncover something problematic. Half of it is literally submerged, not from the hurricane. It was always submerged. It's marshland. It always has been. The foundation collapses. Instantly, $1 billion in real estate valuation disappears in 1926. That's approximately $18 billion in current currency gone. But here's the component that matters. Nobody connected the relationships. Everyone stated that's just Florida. Local problem. The national economy is stable. Except it wasn't stable. Those Florida land transactions had been financed by rural banks throughout the country. When the land became valueless, those banks started collapsing. By 1929, over 600 banks had already failed before the stock market collapsed, before anyone panicked. The stock market collapse on Black Tuesday wasn't the origin of the Depression. It was the indication. The real estate debt had already distributed through the financial system like toxin in the circulation. The stock collapse was just when everyone finally recognized the patient was dying. And here's the element that should make your skin crawl. In 1928, a complete year before the collapse, wealthy insiders began relocating their capital. J.P. Morgan personally transferred $60 million in gold to European repositories in the spring of 1928. The Rockefellers discreetly shifted into treasury bonds. They anticipated it approaching. But the typical homeowner, they didn't forfeit their residence in 1929. They forfeited it in 1933, 4 years afterward, because banks began demanding mortgages early. Not because borrowers failed, but because banks required liquidity to endure. Your residence wasn't your asset. It was the bank's emergency escape route. Millions of individuals who completed every payment punctually still forfeited everything because the system collapsed. They were positioned too proximate when it imploded. Now, advance forward 60 years. It's 1996. Reagan is president, the economy is flourishing, Wall Street is generating wealth, and 747 banks are about to vanish. The savings and loan disaster is the collapse nobody recalls because it occurred gradually, like carbon monoxide poisoning. You don't recognize anything problematic until you're already deceased. Here's what occurred. In the early 1980 seconds, Congress deregulated savings and loan establishments. These were the community banks that held your mortgage and your savings account, boring, stable establishments. Except abruptly, they weren't boring anymore. The new regulations permitted them to execute risky commercial real estate loans, and they went absolutely insane with it. In Texas alone, S&Ls financed entire vacant office parks, structures with zero tenants, pure speculation. By 1985, commercial real estate vacancy percentages in the Southwest reached 30%. 3 out of every 10 commercial structures were completely vacant. And here's the smoking evidence that should infuriate you. In 1984, federal regulators understood. The Federal Home Loan Bank Board had internal memoranda displaying that nearly 500 S&Ls were technically insolvent, bankrupt, deceased establishments still operating, but they concealed the reports. They didn't desire to alarm the market. They imagined they could control it discreetly, permit the problem establishments gradually collapse without initiating panic. That strategy functioned excellently until it didn't. When the barrier finally fractured in 1989, it cost taxpayers $132 billion to rescue the system. But here's what they don't reference in the history books. Over 1,000 S&Ls simply disappeared. If your mortgage was possessed by one of those banks, congratulations. Your loan got transferred to a vulture fund, and that vulture fund immediately modified your terms or initiated foreclosure proceedings. Hundreds of thousands of individuals who had been completing their payments to a local bank they trusted abruptly found themselves managing a collections agency in another state that didn't care about their circumstances. And here's the truly insane component. Many of these collapsed S&Ls had invested depositor savings into the identical risky real estate projects they were financing. Your savings account was funding the bubble that would subsequently destroy your savings account. The serpent was consuming its own tail. The disaster only concluded because home valuations kept climbing in coastal markets. California and New York rescued Texas and Arizona. The disease didn't get remedied. It just relocated to a different component of the body. Now, let's discuss the practice run, the one you definitely recall. You understand this narrative. Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, too big to collapse. The Great Recession, foreclosure signs on every block. But let me demonstrate the frame everyone overlooked. The 2008 collapse didn't begin with subprime mortgages. It began in 2004 when the SEC executed a mundane regulatory modification called the net capital rule. This modification permitted investment banks to leverage themselves 30 to 1 instead of 12 to 1. Comprehend that again. Banks could abruptly gamble $30 for every $1 they actually possessed. So they did. They bundled subprime mortgages into something called CDOs, collateralized debt obligations. They got ratings agencies to attach labels on them, and they marketed them to pension funds and retirement accounts as secure investments, except they weren't secure. The banks understood they were garbage, and here's how we understand they understood. In 2006, Goldman Sachs constructed a CDO specifically engineered to collapse. They named it Abacus 2007 AC1. They marketed it to clients while simultaneously wagering against it. When it imploded, Goldman generated billions. Their clients forfeited everything. This isn't conspiracy hypothesis. It emerged in Senate hearings. It's documented reality. When the collapse struck in September 2008, 3.8 million Americans forfeited their residences to foreclosure within 2 years. Not because they were reckless, not because they falsified on applications, but because the entire system was constructed on fraud from the beginning. And here's the component that connects to right now. We didn't repair the problem, we made it larger. The Federal Reserve reduced interest rates to zero and generated $4.5 trillion. That capital flooded into the economy. And where did it go? Real estate. Again, we resolved a debt disaster by generating more debt. The bubble didn't explode. It just inflated larger. And now 16 years afterward, we're positioned underneath a balloon the magnitude of the moon, and someone just extracted a needle. Let me demonstrate precisely where we are on the leverage ladder. And I'm going to provide you specific dates and figures because this isn't speculation, this is documented reality. We completed phase 1, the base between 2020 and 2023. Throughout COVID, mortgage rates declined to 2.7% free capital. Housing valuations jumped 40% nationally in 3 years. If you purchased a $300,000 residence in January 2020, it's supposedly valued $420,000 now. But here's the reality verification. According to the Atlanta Fed's Home Ownership Affordability Monitor, as of November 2024, the median household requires to allocate 41% of their gross income to afford the median-priced residence. The historical typical is 25% or 60% above sustainable thresholds. That's not a market, that's a Ponzi strategy, and we're exhausting new purchasers to keep it operating. Now we're deep into phase 2, the snare. And the indicators are everywhere if you understand where to investigate. In March 2024, something critical occurred. The yield curve inverted for the 18th consecutive month. That's the longest inversion in documented history. And here's what's frightening about that. Every single instance the yield curve has inverted for more than 12 months, a recession has followed within 18 months, every single instance. But that's not even the significant component. In August 2024, Japan elevated interest rates for the first instance in 17 years. You might be considering, who cares about Japan? You should care because Japanese banks possess over $1.2 trillion in U.S. mortgage-backed securities. And when Japan elevated rates, the carry trade imploded. Within 72 hours, U.S. mortgage bond valuations declined 8%, the fastest reduction since 2008. The Federal Reserve had to intervene and purchase $80 billion in mortgage-backed securities just to halt the freefall. That wasn't normal market operations. That was emergency intervention, and it barely made the coverage. Now layer this on top. As of December 2024, $1.5 trillion in commercial real estate loans are maturing between now and the conclusion of 2026. These are office structures sitting vacant because everyone operates from home now. The default percentage on these loans is already 12%, triple the historical typical. When these structures get liquidated at 40 or 50 cents on the dollar, those losses don't just vanish. They flow directly into the balance sheets of the banks that also possess your residential mortgage. We're not observing disconnected incidents. We're observing dominoes getting into arrangement. Here's what mainstream financial media is overlooking. They're observing the Federal Reserve. They're observing unemployment figures. They're observing inflation information. They're observing the incorrect element. The catalyst is concealed in the derivatives market, and almost nobody's paying attention right now. U.S. banks have $210 trillion in outstanding derivatives contracts. Let me position that in perspective. That's 8 times the entire U.S. GDP. Most of these contracts are interest rate swaps and credit default swaps connected to real estate debt. These derivatives function like insurance policies. Bank A commits to compensate Bank B if certain conditions are satisfied. Bank B commits to compensate Bank C. Bank C commits to compensate Bank A. It's a giant circular chain of commitments, and it functions flawlessly as long as everyone can compensate. But the instant one link fractures, the entire chain detonates. Consider Lehman Brothers. In 2008, Lehman didn't implode because their mortgages went defective. They imploded because nobody would trade with them anymore. Counterparty risk. When other banks halted trusting Lehman's capability to satisfy their obligations, liquidity disappeared instantly. On November 14, 2024, Deutsche Bank disclosed $1.2 billion in losses on real estate-linked derivatives. Not a default, just losses. That's the first fracture in the barrier. Here's what occurs next. When one major bank fails to satisfy a margin demand on these derivative contracts, every other bank freezes. They halt lending. They halt trading. They accumulate cash. Credit market seizes up like an engine without oil. And when credit freezes, the housing market expires because 90% of home purchases require a mortgage. No credit signifies no purchasers. No purchasers signifies valuations implode. The Federal Reserve comprehends this. That's precisely why they absorbed $2.3 trillion in mortgage-backed securities this year. They're attempting to become the purchaser of last resort before the avalanche initiates. But they can't purchase everything. The market is too massive, the leverage is too extreme, and everyone in the financial system comprehends it. Let me provide you the roadmap. This is how the dominoes collapse. Domino 1 collapses in Q1 2025. Commercial real estate defaults intensify. Regional banks, not the major names you recognize, but the mid-tier lenders in Phoenix and Nashville and Boise, begin collapsing. When one goes under, depositors panic, and bank runs don't resemble the old days anymore. There are no queues out the entrance. It's just individuals clicking transfer on their device at 2 a.m. Domino 2 collapses in Q2 2025. Credit card defaults surge. As of October 2024, credit card debt reached $1.13 trillion, with delinquency percentages at 3.1%, the highest threshold since 2011. When individuals can't compensate their credit cards, they halt compensating their mortgage next. It's that straightforward. Domino 3 collapses in Q3 2025. Compelled liquidation commences. All those homeowners who purchased at the summit in 2021 and 2022 with 3% down have zero equity cushion. When valuations decline just 10%, they're submerged. Abandoning becomes the rational selection. Foreclosures flood the market. Domino 4 collapses in Q4 2025 or Q1 2026. The avalanche valuations collapse 20 to 30% nationally faster in the overheated markets like Austin and Phoenix and Boise. Banks possessing these mortgages have to mark them to market. Their capital requirements get violated, lending completely freezes, and if you require to liquidate, there are no purchasers. If you require to refinance, there are no loans. If you require to access your equity, there's no equity remaining. That's when 40 million homeowners awaken and realize they're confined. They possess an asset they can't liquidate, can't refinance, and can't afford to maintain. I comprehend what you're considering right now. You're considering, okay, but this instance is different. Because, let me interrupt you. That sentence, "this instance is different," has been expressed before every collapse in documented history. It's the four most hazardous words in the English language. You're considering the banks are more regulated now after 2008. Dodd-Frank stress evaluations, capital requirements. All accurate, but Silicon Valley Bank passed its stress evaluation 1 month before imploding in 48 hours in March 2023. Then Signature Bank went down. Then First Republic. 3 major banks eliminated in 8 weeks. The regulations didn't collapse. They just don't account for velocity. Capital relocates at the velocity of the internet now. Regulations constructed for the 1,930 seconds are like bringing a sundial to a rocket launch. And those regulations only apply to traditional banks anyway, not hedge funds, not private equity, not the shadow banking system that now controls $52 trillion in assets, twice the magnitude of the traditional banking sector. The risk didn't vanish after 2008. It just relocated where regulators can't observe it. You're also considering individuals have more equity this instance, not like the subprime borrowers in 2008. Accurate, the typical homeowner does have more equity. But typicals deceive because 63% of all mortgages issued since 2020 went to first-time purchasers. These individuals purchased at the absolute summit with minimal down payments using FHA loans. When valuations decline 15%, they're completely eliminated, and they represent 28 million households. Meanwhile, corporate investors now possess 7% of single-family residences, up from 2% in 2019. These aren't homeowners, they're fiduciaries, managing other individuals' capital. When the market transforms, they don't endure it out. They liquidate rapidly, and that intensifies the avalanche. And your final objection, the government will rescue everyone out again. Will they? Let's execute the calculation. In 2008, the rescue cost $700 billion in TARP, plus $4.5 trillion in Federal Reserve asset purchases. Total approximately $5.2 trillion. The mortgage market today is $12 trillion. Commercial real estate is another $5 trillion. Credit cards, auto loans, student debt. Add it all up and you're examining a potential disaster twice the magnitude of 2008. The Fed's balance sheet is already $7.4 trillion. The national debt is $36 trillion. The deficit is $2 trillion per year. The political determination for another massive rescue, especially to assist affluent homeowners, doesn't exist. They can't generate their way out this instance without either destroying the dollar or initiating a political revolution. Probably both. So, no, this instance isn't different. This instance is worse. Here's the pattern in one sentence. Debt-fueled asset bubbles always implode when the cost of servicing the debt surpasses the return on the asset. We're there. Now, what do you execute? First, calculate your real mortgage to valuation ratio, not what Zillow states, what you could actually liquidate for if you listed tomorrow and required to close in 30 days. Be honest. Subtract another 10% because valuations are declining, not climbing. If you're above 80% loan to valuation, you're in jeopardy. If you're above 90%, you're possessing a time explosive. Second, construct liquid reserves immediately. You require 12 months of expenses in cash, not stocks, not crypto, not home equity, actual cash. High yield savings accounts compensating 4 to 5%. Treasury bills mundane and secure. The objective isn't to get affluent, it's to endure when credit markets freeze and you can't reach anything. Third, stress. Evaluate your income. If you forfeited your employment tomorrow, how long could you complete your mortgage payment? If it's less than 6 months, you have 3 options. Increase income, decrease expenses, or liquidate before the market transforms. I comprehend that sounds extreme. It's supposed to. Fourth, if you're remaining in your residence long term, get a HELOC now while you still can, even if you don't require it. Having an open line of credit before banks shut them down provides you options when everyone else has none. And fifth, if you're liquid and stable, arrange yourself for the opportunity. The avalanche generates generational purchasing chances, but only if you have cash when everyone else is compelled to liquidate. I'm not stating collapse your lifestyle to time the market. I'm stating don't be the final individual to figure out the music has halted. The pattern has repeated across centuries, countries, and currencies. The technology modifies. The terminology evolves, but human nature, greed, denial, panic remains precisely the same. In 1929, individuals believed the market had reached a permanently high plateau. In 2006, individuals believed housing valuations never decline. In 2024, individuals believe the Fed has our support. The Fed doesn't have your support. They have the system's support. And if rescuing the system signifies you forfeit your residence, that's a trade they'll execute every single instance without hesitation. 40 million homeowners aren't going to forfeit everything because of defective luck or cosmic accident. They're going to forfeit everything because the calculation demands it. The leverage must dissolve, the debt must be destroyed. And if you're positioned on the incorrect side of that equation when the music halts, no amount of hope or prayer will rescue you. The catalyst is already activated, the projectile is already in flight. The only question is whether you're positioned in its trajectory. I'll observe you in part 2, where I expose the 3 specific markets that collapse first, the one bank indicator that informs you the avalanche has initiated, and the single asset class that actually gains valuation when housing implodes. Subscribe, activate notifications, because when this fractures, it's going to fracture rapidly. And the information you require won't be on the evening coverage until it's already too late. In every disaster, fortunes aren't destroyed. They're transferred from those who didn't observe it, approaching to those who did.